Welcome, movie fans. Thanks for joining us for episode 110 of Reading Between the Reels, the premier podcast of Vampire Pomeranians. If you're a new listener, we're so glad you found us. If you've been enjoying the show, please like, follow, and subscribe, and review us on iTunes or Spotify. You can also support the show by posting on your socials and joining our Facebook group. I'm Greg Dickinson, and I'm flying solo tonight, as Corey Heichman and Justin Hilton couldn't make it, but they should be back next time. As for what I've been watching this last week, quite a bit, actually. We're coming out of the holiday season, so it's been a little bit of a downtime. Just went back to work teaching this last week. So in the interim, though, between the last episode and this one, I've finished off a couple of Hitchcock movies. I've been kind of doing a series of that, so I finally watched Rear Window, which I thought was fantastic. Also watched North by Northwest, and that was also very, very good. Since the movie that we're doing today, which if you've downloaded this, you can already tell is Blade Trinity, and that features Ryan Reynolds, I was in the mood to revisit Green Lantern. So went back and watched that and actually enjoyed that quite a bit. I saw it in the theater and I liked it then. It's not a great movie, but I think it has its charms. I also finished Dune Prophecy. That's finished. Again, I'm a huge fan of Denis Villeneuve in general, but also his Dune and Dune Part 2 from this last year, and that fits very nicely in that universe. Also checked out finally Superman, not quite sure how to pronounce that, the documentary about Christopher Reeve and his life. That's currently airing on Max, and if you haven't seen it, and if you're a fan of those movies at all, I highly, highly recommend checking that out. It is excellent, and if you're a fan of those, it will give you chills in all the best ways. Speaking of Superman, we've also had the release of the Superman teaser, James Gunn's Superman, which is due out this summer. And we definitely have some thoughts about that, and I'm going to save that discussion for a later time when I have all three guys here. But suffice to say, I'm excited because I love Superman, and there's nothing in there that I saw that I was not pleased by. So we'll talk more about that in future episodes. But as I was saying, today on the show, we are looking at Blade Trinity from 2004. This is directed by David Goyer, who was the writer of the trilogy, and he finally was able to, this is his movie. He took over completely. It's all him, for better or for worse. And let's talk about some overall thoughts on Blade Trinity. First off, we didn't really get to talk about it during our second Blade 2, but Chris Christopherson, rest in peace, great actor, fantastic as Whistler in these films. I just wanted to make sure that we absolutely call that out. He is definitely missed, and thoughts and prayers with his family. But as for the movie itself, by all accounts, production was rough, and it's kind of amazing that this film was made at all. Kind of fantastic that it even came out. But yeah, Wesley Snipes apparently had a lot of issues on set, did not get along with his co-stars at all. Didn't get along with David Goyer, didn't get along with Ryan Reynolds. It was rough, but yeah, so I think that some of that comes out in the movie itself. I will say that I wouldn't say that this is a good movie necessarily, but I do think it's fun. It's a movie that I've bought. It's a movie that I've watched over and over again because there are certain moments in it that I really, really like. But I think my final thought at the beginning here is just that the vampires and really Ryan Reynolds to some extent are basically acting in an entirely different movie from Blade, because he plays it completely straight. He's done this before, but tonally this movie is kind of all over the place, and it was polarizing between the three of us. I will say this. Justin was not a big fan of this movie. He had not seen it prior to the rewatch for this episode. Corey liked it a lot, so that's kind of funny. I would have fit in the middle of that, but shout out to those two guys for that. So let's go ahead and talk about what we can pull from cinematography. So again, composition, color, camera work. And the first thing that I have to say is that the opening fight sequence / credit sequence is fantastic. And that really, for me, is probably the high point of the film. I mean, you have, the C4 goes off, and then Blade emerges from kind of the smoke. There's like this shimmering effect, exploded vampire, and then he kind of comes walking through and comes into focus, and then it cuts to this wide shot, and Blade jumps over the car, and it's bird's eye view right away. Lots of quick edits. It's very, very cool. Conversely, going slowly, there's a really interesting scene which I really liked a lot, where Drake, Dracula, in this film, is moving slowly through the city as everything else is racing by. And my take on this was that, my interpretation is that this is talking about his immortality, his permanence, right? He's not in a hurry because all the things that are happening, those lives are going very quickly. Which is interesting about that is that same effect is echoed at the end, because you see Blade riding his motorcycle through the city, and you have that same thing where Blade's going slow and the city's going very fast. So Drake's comments at the end of the film about Blade essentially taking up the mantle and being being Drake's legacy, I think, are kind of proven true there. One last thing, composition-wise, before we get to color camera work, is that there's a great shot and this is near the end here, where you have the cool shot of the city that's reflected in Blade's glasses. I like that quite a bit. I thought that was a really cool shot. As far as color goes, I don't have a ton of notes on this one, just that there's a lot of that same kind of sickly yellow lighting at night, because it's poison out there. It's not a good place to be. There's a lot of that cold bluish gray lighting indoors, especially, and then you still have Blade has the bright red t-shirts. He has a short sleeve and a long sleeve this time. As far as camera work goes, there's some great shaky cam at the beginning where Drake is awakened, which I think really heightens the intensity, which is followed shortly after when we get to the Blade intro, that there's a close-up on the C4, so you can kind of tell there's impending destruction coming. And yeah, that whole fight scene, as I kind of alluded to, full shots during the fight scene, so we can really see the choreography, really see that Wesley Snipes is doing the fighting with what's probably stuntmen as those vampires. And yeah, I mentioned this in earlier episodes about Blade, that Blade, Wesley Snipes, is often shot with a low angle because it makes him more imposing. But you see that a lot when he's coming out of the police station. There's also some other cool things in that police station scene. You have a first person of the point of view of the arrow ricocheting around the corner. And later on, we have Drake is, after he kills the psychiatrist, Blade chases him through the city, and there's a lot of quick shots at various angles, extreme highs, extreme lows. Thankfully, not any first person a la Jason Bourne, which always makes me a little nauseous. But I thought it was a really engaging chase. And then, of course, we have some other things. Just one last thing on cinematography here is that there's this kind of classically used series of close-up shots during the suit-up montage before the last battle while This Blood by Black Lab is playing. Speaking of sound, moving down to there, I'm still huge fan. One of my favorite special effects is the vampires kind of crumbling to ash. I think that's just kind of a cool sound. There's actually something substantial to them as they break. And I also really like the Drake's kind of scale crinkling morphine sound. It's mentioned that he would probably have like snake-ish bones, and that's how he can move. And I think that's done really well. As for the soundtrack, the score's by Ramin Djawadi, who also did Iron Man and probably most famously Game of Thrones. He opens with a track. One of his first tracks is called Blade's Back, which I really like. Kind of harkens back to some of the earlier films with electronica, which heavily prominently there, with the strings and horn and the guitar. But there's a lot of pop music on this, multiple songs. We got a couple by Overseer. Velocity Shift is early on when we see Abigail Whistler revealing herself. Kind of ironically used, we have the classical theme from Summer Place by Percy Faith, kind of some soft orchestral music, which is funny when you watch this with the subtitles, how it's described as soft orchestral music. As they exit the police station, Hannibal and Abigail, after they free Blade, which that leads right into when the guns come out, it's Dex pulls up with their ride, so you got some hip-hop mixed in there. That scene I alluded to earlier, as Drake is making his way through the city, is a song called Fatal by RZA, who also, Ramin Djawadi and RZA all kind of co-wrote the score, worked together on this. We have a song by Crystal Method called Starting Over, as Abigail takes her final arrow shots before heading out to rescue her friends. Skylight by Overseer, there's a second one, as Blade just runs through dudes after rescuing Hannibal King. Just very cool. And then we have another Crystal Method song called Weapons of Mass Distortion, the final Blade versus Drake fight, which is also intercut with Hannibal fighting Jarko. As far as vocal sounds go, we have an opening and a closing narration by Ryan Reynolds, which is kind of fun, and kind of sets the scene a little bit differently, kind of brings us in, introduces Hannibal King that way too. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to go. We didn't have that in the other two movies, so kind of a different choice. As far as performance goes, I mentioned this at the top, that I think they're kind of uneven. I think Wesley Snipes is stoic to a point, maybe more on the static acting. We usually talk about the 3-pronged sliding scale of acting: static, dramatic, and melodramatic. Most everybody else is pretty melodramatic. I think Dominic Purcell, who plays Drake, is okay in it, but it's a weird choice to have. I think to have Parker Posey playing a vampire, Danica Talos. She's classically over the top, and of course, she's heavily featured in the Christopher Guest movies, and I remember seeing interviews about David Goyer kind of trying to sneak that in. So you have him, and you have her rather, and then you also have John Michael Higgins, who plays Edgar Vance, the psychiatrist, and so there's a little bit of a nod to the Christopher Guest mockumentaries, and it just, for me, tonally, that doesn't really work. They're kind of all over the place. Ryan Reynolds, love Ryan Reynolds, and Justin, huge Ryan Reynolds fan. It's kind of ironic. This is the first Ryan Reynolds film that we're doing, and he's not here. So Justin, that's for you. When Justin and I talked about this off mic, that he really is kind of playing Deadpool, although Ryan Reynolds and Deadpool are kind of the same person anyway. So in a lot of ways, but yeah, Ryan Reynolds plays a character called Hannibal King in this, and it is very much proto Deadpool the way that he talks, and so most of what I had for dialogue was quoted by him, and so I'm not going to spend a ton of time with that, but I do have a couple ones that I really like. At the beginning, we have the beginning of the relationship with Blade. Hannibal King says, "We call ourselves the Night Stalkers." And Blade says, sounds like rejects from a Saturday morning cartoon. And Hannibal says, well, we were going to go with the Care Bears, but that was taken. So vintage Ryan Reynolds there. And then a couple of other ones that I thought were really good. I think I'm just going to give you one that doesn't have Ryan Reynolds, just for a little bit of different flavor here, which I thought was really nice. Zoe is a young girl, the daughter of one of the Night Stalkers. Watches Blade inhale his serum, and she says, why do you do that? And Blade says, because there's something bad inside of me. This keeps it from getting out. And Zoe says, why can't you just be nice? And Blade says, because the world isn't nice. And I like that quite a bit. I think that was a really kind of a nice moment where we see a little bit of a softer side of Blade, but also not sugarcoating it. To a degree. He's also making sure that the girl knows, like, there's a reason, there's bad things out there. There's a reason that I have to do this. Some other things I really like performance-wise, as far as body language, facial expressions, just always struck me as funny that you see a vampire flipping off the sun in the Syrian desert at the beginning, because they're just completely covered in that full-body tactical gear. There's a great moment, I think, when Blade's being interrogated at the police station, where Blade hisses at Vance. That's John Michael Higgins' character, and you can see that John Michael Higgins has been pretty cocky in that interaction that whole time, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh shoot, this is actually kind of scary. And really the prevailing facial expression throughout this movie is that Blade just pretty much just glares at Wesley Snipes. Like, I don't know if he's really acting. It's just glaring at Ryan Reynolds throughout. Like, I cannot believe that they're in the same movie together. But yeah, some other things that I liked, or that I noticed, costumes, hair, and makeup, is that the vampires, especially Danica Talos, Parker Posey's character, has contact lenses, which kind of pulled me out a little bit because we hadn't seen that earlier. It's not really consistent with what we saw from the first couple Blade movies. Like Stephen Dorff, for instance, did not have contact lenses. He pulled that off without those. Drake's armor and monster form I thought were interesting. I'm not sure I'm a fan of it, but it's an interesting choice. They definitely went the other way from a traditional Dracula presentation, so kudos to that. And of course, we see the return of the vampire glyph tattoos. Okay, moving down to setting and design. One thing that I thought was really interesting, and I found in my research, and I'd seen it, never really knew quite what to do with it, is that there's this concept called Esperanto. Well, it's a language. It's the world's most widely spoken, constructed international auxiliary language. Yeah, that's the definition that I got. So it's not really an authentic language. It's completely constructed to be kind of a trade language, essentially. So you see lots of signs, and there's a flag at one point. In this fictional city, we don't actually get the city, but it is bilingual. The city's bilingual. We see Whistler speaking another language. We see that movie with Shatner at one point speaking Esperanto. So I thought that's kind of an interesting thing to do there. We've seen different settings from Blade in the first movie, pretty much just in LA, and then in Europe in the second movie, and here some unknown place. I thought it was interesting that it started in the Syrian desert in Iraq at the beginning, where they would find Dracula, and they go back to, it's kind of an older version, like we typically think of Dracula, of course, being Transylvania. But here it's, he's like one of the very first creatures in the cradle of civilization. So I thought that was interesting. Other location I wanted to mention was the warehouse of humans being bled. We have this blood farming facility. You have the vampire final solution, which is effectively very, very creepy. Moving down to set decoration, we see once again that Blade's base of operations is very utilitarian again. In this case, there's even like plastic sheeting hanging up from the ceiling there. The police interrogation room, which I mentioned the color, being kind of that blue-gray, is very cold and very sterile. But I have to mention, speaking of plastic sheeting, the row after row of humans in plastic is the vampire final solution is just so creepy and so effective, and there's so many of them. I think that's a very effective, believable set there. I like that quite a bit. As far as props go, we have Blade's new knife on a string. Not sure exactly what you'd call that. We see Blade's car again, 1968 Dodge Charger, which is now equipped with ultraviolet lights, which is pretty great. We see that in action in a great car chase. Again, the beginning of this movie is so good, and I had high hopes. I remember seeing this in the theater and thinking, this is fantastic, and then it really kind of just takes a left turn. Doesn't quite go. It doesn't fulfill the promise of the first, say, 15 minutes. And again, in that section, we have Danica Talos has this huge, just enormous video camera, which I think dates the film quite a bit. Again, it's 20 years old, so it's understandable. At the time, it didn't bug me, but now it's kind of strange. I mean, there'd be, hundreds of pedestrians or even people in their cars with their phones taking pictures and video. We have a couple of cool new gadgets, though. We do have the UV, the arc, with the kind of light blade thing. We get to see that in action. The serum inhaler, I mentioned that earlier. I have to put it, I'm not sure where else to put it. We'll put it here, the props for the vampire Pomeranian, which is hilarious. And again, but speaks also to the kind of the tonal shifts in this movie, kind of all over the place. But one thing we have to talk about, I think, and I would have loved to have this discussion with guys and listeners. I would love to hear from you guys what you thought about this. And I may have to put something in the Facebook group about this. But the MP3 player, and not so much that it's an MP3 player, but the fact that Abigail Whistler, Jessica Biel's character, is using that, and how incredibly impractical it would be. She's got a soundtrack for hunting. That's kind of how it's explained. But she can't hear what's going on as she's trying to kill vampires, and they are presumably trying to kill her as well. So it sounds good in theory, but just really not smart. So as far as characters go, we've talked about just about everybody, I think, at this point. But Wesley Snipes, again, is great. as Blade, and but he's, I think, a little bit underused here. It's a weird fit for the movie. Jessica Biel is fine as Abigail Whistler. She doesn't have a whole lot to do, but I think she's fine in it. Ryan Reynolds is hilarious, but what movie is he in? And we do get the payoff, of course, in Deadpool and Wolverine, where we have the bit where Blade says, "I don't like you," and he replies, "Never did." And so that's kind of the one lift we get, the one callback, I suppose, to this film. Dominic Purcell as Dracula is good in a lot of things that I've seen him in. A lot of people are a big fan of Prison Break. I don't think I've ever actually seen that. I liked him fine in the CW stuff, and I've seen him in some other things. John Doe, I think, was a very short-lived show that I liked him in, but I don't think he is a good fit for Dracula. He's just not charismatic enough. And I mentioned Stephen Dorff earlier, who I think is a far superior villain. There's not really a great villain in Blade 2, but I think really there's so many other great characters in there with the other vampires that he's forced to team up with, Ron Perlman's character and such as. So it's not enough for this film, I don't think. Chris Christopherson is in this movie very little and dies at the beginning. Minor spoiler for a 20-year-old movie. It's nice that he's back, but I was sad that he died in this, and that we didn't get to see him as much. I mentioned Parker Posey. Callum Keith Rennie is another one you see a lot. As I mentioned many times on the show, I'm working my way through Battlestar Galactica, the newer one. He's in that, plays a Cylon. He plays Asher Talos, Danica's brother. We have Triple H, who does, I think, a fine job, as far as professional wrestlers turn actors. He's fine in this. Natasha Lyonne plays Summerfield, and she's good in this in a very small part. I've liked her a lot in other things. She's not very used very well here, or very, very much here, I should say. She's fine. Let's see. Other than that, Patton Oswalt's in here as Hedges. He's kind of funny, a little bit of comic relief. And I know, and I talked to Justin about this as well, that really what they're very much setting up is a potential. It's kind of like a backdoor pilot. Like if this was a TV show, they're setting up the Night Stalkers TV show, and in this case, they're setting up a Night Stalkers spinoff film, and so that's why you have all of these characters, and they're kind of fleshed out, kind of, or hinted at where they're going to go, but we never really get to see them because a lot of them are killed, which is kind of an interesting choice. So, moving on, let's talk about Hero's Journey. It's not that kind of film, so we can move on. As far as the world building, I think one thing that's really interesting is that Drake refers to quote-unquote Stoker's Fable, Bram Stoker's book, as if the novel Dracula is kind of a fictionalized take on a real person. I did like that a lot. I thought that was kind of cool, that Dracula, the story, the novel, all of the movies presumably all exist in this universe, but it's based on a real person. So I thought that's kind of cool. But I will have to say that this feels very self-contained to me. Yeah, at this point, we've talked a lot about in kind of the pre-MCU if things could exist together. At this point, this many films in, this is the 10th film that we've done in this series, there would have been connections made at some point. Like Hannibal King, for instance, would have definitely referenced Spider-Man or the X-Men. He's got enough of a pop culture sensibility, he would be aware of what else is going on. So that does feel like this is in its own. The Blade films are very much in their own universe in this. Even though they're kind of fantastic, we could, like we've talked about before, there's kind of two divergent paths where Daredevil and Punisher kind of fit their own little path here, and then X-Men, Spider-Man, and Blade would all kind of fit together. Yes, I think tonally this kind of fits with that, but the fact that there's no references to it is a little jarring if you're looking at it through that lens. And my final thoughts on Blade Trinity. Just a couple of things just of note is that I thought that X-Men The Last Stand was the first Marvel film with a post-credit scene, and in fact this one is the first one. So if you're watching this film with us, watch through the credits. It's always good to watch through the credits just in case. But yeah, there's a post-credit scene. It's just Blade driving his car through the city. There's not a whole lot else to it. It doesn't really set anything up other than just to say, hey, Blade survived. So you have that. It was, I should mention, the film was nominated for Best Horror Film at the Saturn Awards. So in the moment, the film was received pretty well. but that lost to Shaun of the Dead. So, ultimately, I do enjoy the film, but I do also feel like it feels like the natural end of the series. Almost like it kind of ran out of gas. I mean, once you introduce Dracula as your big bad, like, where do you go from there? I know Buffy the Vampire Slayer did it and moved on, but I don't remember what came after that. And it's time for a rewatch for that, that's for sure. So where would you go after Dracula? And I guess, I mean, there was plans at one point. There was a Morbius cameo that was shot and then not included for the first film. So I suppose you could have tied in all of that stuff, and that would have been interesting. But yeah, we'll never know. So as we close, we just want to say thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on X, Instagram, and Facebook. Email us at readingbetweenreels@gmail.com or use the SpeakPipe app on our website. If you enjoyed the show, please like, follow, or subscribe, and review us on iTunes or Spotify. And one last thing, our next episode will be a review of Elektra, starring Jennifer Garner. Send us an email or voicemail about your favorite moments from Elektra, and we'll share it on the next episode.